You can't cook soup with a candle. Complex subjects in reptile heating. Topics covered will be heat versus temperature, thermal hours, and ambient temperatures. Hey guys, what's up? It's Evan, and this is Thanksgiving week 2024. So it's a short week at school, and then I'm gonna go and gorge on turkey and just be stressed out about other things in life. But today's video is actually part of trying to feed into a trend that's going through the thought community around reptiles right now, and that's temperatures. And specifically what I want to point out to you guys is that there are two videos that kind of inspired me to make this, and I don't want to be iterative, and these aren't exactly responses to them, but I'm going to point you in that direction and really encourage you to go look at them. And the first one is Jeff Roney, the boa file. I don't know if it's Ronnie or Roney, but the boa file. He is releasing a bunch of videos right now. He's calling them like boa breeding 101, 102, 103. They are outrageous, people. The one, I'm going to put a link to one specifically. It's about boa ovulation, and he talks about temperatures and heat in there. So that's one of the things that's influencing this trend of thought for me. And the other person is Jason Raimondi. He did one about night drops. So I'm going to put a link to both of those down directly in my description. So the point I would make to you guys is that, first of all, don't be in a vacuum. So don't just listen to me, and also realize what I am is not the most experienced person, but I do have a pretty good way of connecting with you guys and putting out that knowledge in a way that people are able to hold on to. So I think that's why I'm appealing to you, but also go deep dive into some of these other subject area experts. They are much more experienced than I am. And the other thing I will tell you is, especially the Jeff Roney videos, they're not super exciting. They are really, if you watch to the end of those, it's because you're really in it for the passion and the granular level interest of the snakes. There's not going to be a lot of flashy things in there. But as somebody who's figured out to breed animals through open source knowledge, here's what I'll tell you. It's all out there for you to figure out how to do it. And the thing I will tell you is that the places where the best knowledge are hidden usually aren't the most exciting and flashy. So there are a couple different types of YouTube videos out there on reptiles, and the ones that tend to catch a lot of people's attentions are really just more surface level. But if you're really passionate about your reptiles and deep diving and understanding about them, go into those two, go into some other really obscure types of podcasts and videos around those. Another thing I'll tell you is that a video like this is going to be kind of difficult to wrap your head around. So I'm going to encourage you to stick through it, because if you're really serious about animals and reptiles, these complex subjects in reptile heating are things that will really serve you well once you try to do things beyond just keep your pet alive. And they will also, they're things that, they're slippery concepts, guys, and they're things that I've been keeping reptiles off and on for about 25 years, and they're things that I barely hold on to. You know, like, one of the things that really impresses me about very smart people is their way to just hold in their hand a complex subject that I can only just keep dipping my hands into, and then the concept slips through my fingers. A lot of these are the types of subjects and concepts where I scoop, and then they kind of slip through my fingers, and I have to re-scoop them and rethink about them. And maybe you guys can help me out here. I'm trying to think of a video. I wanted to show this little clip from this early 2000s, like, philosophical video, but it was not one of these videos, but there's a whole trend of these philosophical videos that came out in the early 2000s, like What the Bleep Do We Know, You, Me, and Everyone We Know, and Waking Life. There was another one that was like that, and they were trying to explain space-time relativity with a sheet, and the guy was going crazy. He had the sheet over his hands, and it pops up here and over here and here over here, and the whole point being is that everything was connected, and that space was relative to time and vice versa. And so all of these concepts are kind of like that with a sheet. So heat versus temperature is relative to thermal hours, is relative to ambient temperatures. They are not just a two-dimensional thing. It's a multi-dimensional thing. It's very hard and complex to really fully grasp how they work together and how they work at all and how they exist. But if you can even just be aware that these concepts are out there and talk around the subject, you'll serve yourself much better than if you don't know anything about these. Because that's about as far as I can get on these, is being aware of these subjects and talking around these subjects, and every once in a while I can really point my finger on something that I'm sure about. But beyond that, I'll just tell you that they're subjects that are pretty complex, and if you really hold these in your hands and don't let anything slip out, it means that you're A, probably pretty smart, and B, you've got a lot of hours in this game. So that's just what I'll tell you, and I'm just really encouraging you guys to stick with this, because the hard subjects are the ones that are really going to get you places if you're that type of keeper with those types of interests. But yeah, if you remember what movie I'm trying to think about, it's early 2000s. It was, a feature film. Can't remember the name of it, but if you can point that out to me, that would help me, because it's driving me nuts. But the subject today, the reason I call this "You Can't Cook Soup with a Candle" is because of this first subject: heat versus temperature. And I will just tell you that I used to work in a production setting where basically the primary thing that affected how well the product turned out was thermodynamics. And so one point I will tell you is that heat and temperature and these issues are profoundly important in many aspects of life, and in industry and in science and in medicine, they hold on to these concepts a little more complexly than we do in reptile keeping. So I think that we're talking about thermodynamics here and how they work in general. So the first point I will make to you is that there's a difference between heat and temperature. And this is where I use the example: you can't cook soup with a candle. And I will make these three statements to you right now, and then I'll give you examples about them. You can have the right temperatures, but not enough heat. You can have too high of heat, but be too cold. And you can have the right temperature, but too much heat. And so those are all related to the understanding that heat and temperature are not the same. And so an example of right temperatures but not enough heat would be something like if you're trying to breed a boa and you had a gravid boa constrictor, say 12-pound, 6 to 7 foot boa constrictor in a cage, and you had a 12 by 24 heat mat that had 20 watts on it. And you had that on one side and it was set at 90 degrees. That's an example of where you have the right temperatures but not enough heat, perhaps, because what might happen is you have a surface area that's the right temperature. 90 degrees is a good temperature for a pregnant boa. But if you think about a 12-pound, 15-pound boa constrictor sitting on that heat mat, you don't have enough heat to actually elevate the temperature of the internal body temperature of that snake to a point where it can efficiently cook its babies. So that's an example where you can have the right temperature. That heat mat's the right temperature, but you just don't have enough heat. That's kind of like when they talk about a heat mat being the right temperature, but it doesn't raise the ambient temps. That's kind of the mantra. Heat mats don't raise the ambient temps. That's not totally true. They just don't have a ton of power to raise the ambient temps. If heat mats didn't raise the ambient temps, radiant floors in houses wouldn't be used for heating. They do. It's just you have to recognize that a 20-watt heat mat that's got a footprint of 12 inches by 24 has a lot less heat than a 75-watt heat panel that's about 12 inches by 24. So it's not so much that it's the wrong temperature, but you just don't have that driving heat to raise the temperature of a boa to the fullest that it needs to be. And that's how you get underformed, premature, half-cooked babies and things like that. So that's an example of where you don't have the right temperatures but not enough heat. I'll give you an example of where you have too high of heat, but it's too cold. And this is the classic hot rock example. So those awful hot rock things that people used to use all the time, and they still manufacture for some god-forsaken reason. But the theory wasn't totally dumb. The idea was that a reptile will bask on a rock that's heated by the sun. So if we heat up a piece of masonry, it will simulate a sun-warmed rock. And the issue with that is that they get very, very hot. They're just unregulated, and they were designed without a lot of heating discipline. I think that anything like that should be designed not to raise the temperature like more than 10-15 degrees over ambient temperatures. But they have this little rock that was getting sizzling hot, but people would rely on that for all of the heating needs of that reptile. And so that's why you would see like monitor lizards. Like I've seen baby savanna monitors that are terribly burnt on their bellies, and it's because they have only a hot rock, and so they're trying to huddle on that hot rock, but they are still, because they're too cold. So their body is telling them, their physiology is saying you need to go seek heat. The only heat they have is that heat rock. So their internal signals are saying seek heat, but the only heat they have is burning hot, and that's how they go and they sit on that. And they're never able to get themselves up to temperature, so they sit on it even longer, and that's just a really nasty cycle on how you get horrific burns. So that's another issue where you can have too high of heat, but you're too cold. The temperature is not right. And the last example I'll give you is where you can have the right temp but too much heat. And the example I'll use is when I was like 16 years old, I built this big armoire type thing and had 2x2 little condominium cages in it, and I outfitted a 250 watt chicken brooder bulb in each one, with those big red bulbs that you use to brood chickens in a barn. Each one of those had one of those in there in a cage, and then I was pretty proud of myself, and I was very safe. Then I put in a thermostat, one of those on-off thermostats that you adjust the temperature of the dial using a quarter. And what happened, it was in my bedroom, so I knew what was happening all night long, is I'd set at 90 degrees, and the 250 watt light bulb would go click, off, on, off. And the problem was that the size of the heater was too large for the heating demand it had. So the thermostat was actually controlling it to the right temperature. It was cutting it off at 90, so it was never going to cook the snake, but you weren't tuned properly. You had right temperatures but too much heat. And so what you really want to do when you're using heaters and things, you want to use a heater that is probably that should be running probably 50 to 75% of the time to maintain heat. Or if you use a proportional thermostat, maybe running at between 40 and 75%. That's kind of where you want to be with your heaters, to tune them so that you maintain the right temperatures, but you're not overkilling the heat, because too much heat, overkilling on the heat makes your thermostat cycle on too much. It means that you have too much equipment and kit in your cage, and if you had a failure of the thermostat or something, it just exacerbates any over temperature type thing. So there's examples of how heat versus temperature are not the same thing, and examples on ways where you can have the right heat but not the right temperature, or you can have the right temperature but not the right heat. And so those are just good examples, and I hope that makes sense to you. The next subject we're going to move on to are thermal hours. And this is actually a pretty old school topic, thermal hours or heating hours. And if you actually remember people talking about this, you've probably been in it for a while, but this is still a relevant thing. And basically what I'll tell you is that the way we conceive of reptiles' heating needs, oh, hello, keep thinking in my pocket. The way people think about reptile needs is by their hot temperature, their warm side temperatures and their low side temperatures. And that's a very functional way to think about it, because if you provide the proper temperature ranges, you're going to get a healthy snake unit that way. But thermal hours is a different way of conceiving of reptile heating, and that is by you think about a reptile's heating needs as an input in a number of units of heat. That's how you think about it. So a thermal hour is a unit of heat, just like a BTU, a British thermal unit, is a unit of heat. Just like a calorie is a unit of heat. 1 calorie raises 1 cubic centimeter of water 1 degree Celsius. That's what a unit of heat is. So when we're talking about thermal hours, we're talking about reptile heat needs as in a thermal, as in heat inputs. Another way to conceive of this, and a more fluent way to maybe describe this to you, is to think of your reptile's heating needs as a heat diet, meaning you need to feed your reptile a specific number of thermal units for it to be healthy. And the way that you feed them those thermal units and the number of thermal units that they need varies by the individual animal, by their life stages, and by the species. But here's what you can really think about it. Oh gosh, let's think of something. Generally, over the course of 24 hours, it would be conceived that a snake needs to get a certain amount of heat at that specific life stage to be to remain healthy and maintain all life processes. And so that is dependent on a lot of things. It's dependent on the size of the snake. So a bigger animal, a heavier animal, has relatively more mass to its surface area. Likewise, a heavier bodied animal has relatively more mass to surface area. Conversely, a thin, slender-bodied animal has quite a bit of surface area to body mass. That's why a tall, skinny person like me chills down really quickly. We have a lot of surface area compared to our body mass. Whereas somebody that was a little stouter and more square, they're a little more cold resistant generally because they are they have less surface area compared to mass, so they're not shedding their heat quite as quickly. So each animal has a thermal need based on their physical structure, a thermal need based on their life processes. So a pregnant boa needs more therms than a not pregnant boa. A digesting snake needs more therms than a not digesting snake. And so it's a way of thinking about animals in terms of heat input, a heat diet. So when you're providing heat to your animals, you can think of it not as just raising the temperature, but you're feeding them units of heat. And this is honestly a little more of an industrialized or large-scale way of thinking about your animals, I think, and as well as being a little bit of a more old-school way of thinking about it, in that when you get into the processes of industrial production of animals, it's really all about inputs. And so one of the more expensive inputs with a reptile would be units of heat, because power and energy cost a lot of money. And so it's just another way to hold on to things, but it's also something that you can use just in terms of animals and considering where they're from and what their body structure is, and use these as different proxies for how you might want to deliver your thermal hours. And the examples I will use is that I basically break my animals into two different categories. Tropical or close to tropical animals, and then temperate animals. And so the tropical animals and the close to tropical animals, when I think about those, I think things like my true red-tailed boas primarily. I put the true red-tailed boas aside from pretty much everything else in my collection as the most tropical animal that I keep. The other ones would be Amazon tree boas, but other things that I could think of that would be kind of tropical like that would be like emerald tree boas, anacondas, something like that. They're in places that don't have a lot of day to night variations. So they generally, because they're tropical, it means a couple of things. They want to be warmer at night still than a temperate animal. The other thing being is that they require a little bit more of a narrow range of temperatures that's both warmer and a narrower range. And so tropical is oftentimes a proxy for less hardy, if that makes sense. But also if you just think about their thermal hours and how they need to be fed that thermal diet, they need to be fed a little more consistently through the day and also through the seasons, meaning that temperature range is generally a little bit warmer without a lot of excursions, higher or lower, if that makes sense. Whereas temperate animals, California king snakes, things like that, they can both experience more variation in the course of 24 hours, as well as more variation over the course of a season. And so like a king snake like this, I used to be in California, where these guys live, it can get wicked hot. 95 degrees in the summer, very common. Especially out in the sun, over 100 degrees, very common. And then at night, it can get pretty chilly. So these animals, the way that their thermal hours need to be fed to them is a little different and a little more flexible than a tropical animal. So if you think about a thermal diet, like a food diet, a tropical animal is kind of like meat, where they need to be eating every hour, every couple hours to maintain their blood sugar, because otherwise they don't do well. A tropical animal is more like that, where they need to be fed that consistent, all the time, warm conditions, but not something really hot. Whereas an animal like this is able to go down into the 60s or maybe in the 50s, even in the summer at night, but then it will go out during the day and sunbask and heat gather and get its thermal hours in the daytime. And so that is more, if you think about that, I'm just using the analogy of a diet like food. That's more like something that can eat like once a day. Like some people are just, I eat a big breakfast and that's it, or I only eat dinner. There's one like that. In terms of how these guys consume their heat, they're a little more able to do that. And they are also a little more flexible in how you can deliver their heat. Whereas tropical animals, and that's why temperate animals tend to be a little hardier and less fragile. But for example, this king snake, I could keep this in an open-topped aquarium with a 12-12 light on in my house that has the heat set at 66 degrees. What I would do is I would set up a day basking bulb with a nice warm basking spot that got up to like the low 90s, and I'd turn that on 12 hours a day. And when it shut off, it would only get to be about 65 degrees because that's what ambient. This snake, because it's a temperate animal that can get its thermal hours during the day, and then maintain itself through the night, will do much better like that than a tropical animal would do. Conversely, And as an example of how much more flexible a temperate animal is, you could keep this snake in an ambient room at 82 for the whole day. So 24 hours a day, and it would meet its heating needs as well. It's a different way to get its thermal hours. It's a more steady way to feed it its diet of heat rather than a 12-hour light on. But if you average 95 and 65 and you average 82, you're getting very close to the same thermal hours, if that makes sense. And so that's a good way to think about thermal hours, is that it's an input of heat into your reptile. Tropical animals need the more consistent, smaller inputs over the entire course of the day and the season. So, like a tropical animal, seasonally, I'm not going to go higher than 90 and they're not going to go lower than 75. Whereas this animal, I might expose it to 95 and expose it to 55 or something like that. So over the course of a year, not every day. But so that's just a way to think about the thermal hours and how you deliver them, and be thinking about what might be best for your situation in terms of your rooms, what might be best in terms of your the species you're breeding or you're working with, etc., etc. And so, this thermal hours is kind of relating to Jason Raimondi when he talked about night drops. And so he doesn't use a night drop. He keeps his pretty warm at like 78. And so he's keeping his thermal hours throughout the 24-hour cycle a little more even than how I generally keep things, okay? But we're still getting those thermal hours in, if that makes sense to you guys. And so the last thing I will tell you is that the physical structure of an animal can be used as a way to proxy how that animal needs its thermal hours, or the environment from which it came, how that environment fed it its thermal hours. And so North American snakes tend to be long, slender-bodied animals. So they have a high surface area to body ratio. And by that, and what that means is, if you think about North America, it tends to get pretty warm in most of North America during the day for a lot of the year, and there's lots of places where they could go and sunbath and get pretty warm, but then it always cools off at night. So one thing to think about a thin-bodied animal is, because it has so much more surface area to body mass, it both cools off more quickly and heats up more quickly. So an animal like this can go out, grab its sun, grab its heat, and then go back into a burrow very quickly, because it doesn't want to be out there too long, and because it's vulnerable to predators, and it doesn't want to have to sit there and try to heat up its whole body. If a 10-pound snake would have a much harder time getting its body raised to the right temperature than this 1-pound snake, is I guess what I'm trying to say. So an alternative example to that is like an anaconda or a blood python. Those are things that live in very tropical places, and more than that, they're also semi-aquatic. So water is a giant heat sink, so it stabilizes those temperatures. Those are exceedingly heavy-bodied animals, and the reason they can be so exceedingly heavy-bodied is because they're from places that don't get tons of day-to-night variation. So if you think about it, like the massive examples of a blood python, a 40-pound blood python, how long would it take that to raise that 10 degrees on a versus this? It will take a lot longer. So they're from places that have a lot more stability at temperature. So one proxy is a thinner body snake is generally often from a more temperate place, I guess is what I'd say. And I'll show you a little bit of a paradox to that example. And I've thought about this for a while because it's a good example of a counterexample to what I just said. And that's an Argentine boa constrictor. And so Argentine boa constrictors have been documented in, well, I guess I should say back up. Argentina, the Gran Chaco, the Chaco Seco, the Great Chaco or the Dry Chaco, I've been through there. It's a very temperate place, and it can get quite cold. And actually, in fact, in Vin Russo's book, they said that it's been documented to see these sunbasking with ice and snow on the ground. So it's a little bit surprising to me that these snakes are so heavy-bodied. And I'll just tell you that that's a counterpoint. I've thought about this for a while, and if you want to know why I think that these guys are so heavy-bodied, it's for a couple of things. One, because just like I said, thinner-bodied, higher surface area to mass ratio means they heat up more quickly, they also cool off more quickly. So the fact that this cannot heat up so quickly is mitigated by the fact that it doesn't cool down quite as quickly. if that makes sense. So it's using the reverse strategy to try to get the same means, which is to retain its body temperature and meet its thermal needs. But the other thing I'll tell you is if you think about it, Argentina is much more equatorial, so the sun is going to be much stronger. And that means that even on a cool day, if this thing went out and sunbasked, it would have a much more penetrating, heating infrared spectrum of light coming in. So that's why I think that they're able to be this heavy bodied, is because it both conserves the heat through the night, but also because where they're from, the sun's a little bit stronger, and I do think it probably is relatively warmer in most of the Gran Chaco than it is in a lot of places where North American snakes that you're thinking of are. So that's just a thing that I tell you, but physiology can be a really interesting way to make a proxy guess as to what temperature range or climate that snake is from and how it might need its thermal hours, okay? And so that's a pretty slippery concept, but I hope you're still hanging with me. And the last thing I'm going to tell you is about ambient temperatures. And ambient temperatures is probably the biggest epiphany I've had in reptile keeping. And ambient temperatures are not usually something you think about until you get into larger collections, because larger collections, multiple heaters in a room, change your ambient conditions, so you have to consider them more. But what I will tell you about ambient conditions is that they are just as important as your heater and your cage conditions, and they affect your heater and your cage conditions. And so obviously your ambient temperatures are basically, you can think of them like the low end setting on your thermostat. So if whatever you set your thermostat for the heater on is your high end setting, your ambient temperature is the low end setting for what your snakes can get exposed to. So in terms of cooling animals for breeding, in terms of nighttime drops, a lot of that can happen with ambient temperatures without monkeying with your thermostats too much. And I will just tell you that that is a way to impose those cooler temperatures on your animals while also letting them seek a refuge to higher temperatures. So you can only impose upon your animals the low end temperature, because you can't force them to sit on the high end temperature. You can only force them to sit on the low ends, or the only thing you can non-consensually allow them to do is get no colder than your ambient temperatures, if that makes sense. So ambient temperatures are really where I think most of the cooling factors happen with your snakes. And the other thing I will tell you is to really make sure that those ambient temperatures have an effect on your snake, you need to do two things with your cages. You need to really contain your hot spots, and you need to have them relatively well ventilated. And by that I mean, there's this idea that snake cages need to have big, broad, warm hot spots. And I actually think that's not true. I think they have to have access to their highest needed temperature and a surface area that's about as big as their body coiled up. And they need to have that in a way where they have both the right temperature and enough heat. So that might mean that you keep them in an ambient room, like Jason Raimondi. Okay, Jason Raimondi, he's just put out a video. He said he keeps his room at 78 degrees, and then he keeps his heat tape at 90 degrees or something like that. Don't quote me exactly on that. Whereas me, this room goes down to 66, 68 at nights, almost every night in the winter. But I have a heat hotspot set at 86 in each of these cages, or 88 at night. But it's very small, but it's still a driving heat panel, so it's enough to keep those snakes hot. So for me, I'm relying more on the heaters and not so much the ambient temperatures, whereas Jason's relying more on the ambient temperatures and not so much on the heating power of his cages. And so there's no right or wrong way. I'll tell you that he's been more successful than I am, so I'm not telling you that my way's better. Definitely I'm not telling you that, but I also will tell you that there are just different ways to approach that with ambient temperature. And as long as you're allowing your animals to get their thermal hours in the quantity and in the way they like it fed to them, you're going to be okay. So these are just a really slippery concepts. If you've gotten to the end of this, congratulations. It means you're probably pretty interested in reptiles. And the other thing too is I hope that all makes sense to you guys. And if it doesn't, post down below and ask a specific question and I'll answer them to you. Because these are just things that I wish that I fully understood better than I do, but I understand them semi-well. But these are things that really are diving beyond the basics that you'll get in care sheets and things. So if you can hold on to these, you're well on your way to being successful. And that's just what I would tell you. And thank you guys so much for sticking with this. And if you made it this far, congratulations on your intent interest. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.